Broadcasting from Orchard Park, New York,
and Boca Raton, Florida,
it's the Freight 360 podcast. From freight broker sales tips to sports talk, this podcast is all about helping you grow as a freight broker. We're your hosts, Nate Cross
and Benjamin Kowalski.
Let's talk freight. Welcome back, everybody. It is episode 273 of the Freight 360 podcast. It's going to be a little bit of a deeper dive into last week's episode on, we talked about transparency. We're going to go back kind of the history and evolution of brokerage today and how we got to where we are. And that should give context to a lot of folks listening. But make sure you're checking out everything else. If you're looking for a specific topic, you can use the search bar on our website, freight360.net. We get a lot of people asking like, hey, do you have any sales or prospecting content? Just type in literally sales, prospect, and you'll get everything that has anything to do with that, whether it's a blog, short video, full podcast, etc. Keep sharing us, and check out the Freight Broker Basics course if you're looking for an educational option. That's on our website as well. Let's get into it. Ben, you're I know I'm always asking how's Florida, but apparently it's cold, or it's cooler than normal. So what's the latest?
Yeah, it's like in the 50s this morning. I mean, it's been cold all week.
Some colds, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's nice. We had the Christmas parade over in town tonight. So, like, I appreciate the cold weather when they're doing Christmas stuff. So it's nice putting up the Christmas tree, building a fire, and just, I don't know, makes me feel more like growing up in the North. I still definitely miss the seasons. It's definitely one of the drawbacks of living down here, but...
Totally. We got a couple feet of snow, lake effect snow, over the Thanksgiving long weekend here in Western New York, and we're going to get another... They're calling it 7 inches. Who knows? Maybe a foot tonight. This is what happens, though.
Get your ice skating rink up yet?
No. So I haven't done it since I moved into this newer house. My backyard is not nearly level enough. And I think if I do it again, my kids are actually going to start doing like skating lessons this winter at an ice rink. And if they pick it up, I think I would rather look at one of those kits where, like, instead of me building it from scratch from a bunch of lumber from Lowe's, you just buy like one of the kits and do it that way. We'll see. I got to feel it out. I haven't skated in a couple years myself. But...
You got an HOA up there?
No.
Oh, nice. And zoning issues with the community?
No, the only thing, like, there's something on our neighborhood where I think it's the town. Like, you can't have... They basically don't want people to have a guest house. So basically, you can't build like a detached
dwelling
garage with a living space, or like there's some kind of regulation on that. And every street's a little different. Like some places, you can have a pool house but not a shed. So or you have to apply for a permit. I don't know. There's some dumb rules, man. But anyway, not to get too off topic, we're gonna have Steven on with us today, and we're gonna get into sports here. And if I'm not mistaken, you two faced off against each other this past weekend, Bengals, Steelers, and I gotta tell you, man, that game was a shootout. It was like touchdown, other team touchdown.
Nice
touchdown.
Offense,
and
no
so
joke.
It was like 21-21 when I swapped on to a different game, but ultimately Steelers had it by 6. Take me through. Did you guys both watch it?
I watched all of it. That was Russell Wilson's second best game in his career. It was like over 400 yards.
Yeah.
I mean, if you would have asked, I think anybody, if Cincinnati put that many points up, could the Steelers win? I don't think anybody would have thought. I mean, they definitely. And also, Pickens had a ton of really silly, ridiculous penalties. I mean, there were a couple that probably should have been called, but there were some that were just absurd, that like we lost significant yardage, field position just from, honestly, dumb shit that shouldn't have happened.
Steven, what do you think? You said you were already done with the bungholes, as you call them.
Yeah, I'm over this season. Zach Taylor can go with the rest of them, and we'll find a new defense.
Back up there at some point.
I mean, it's a shame because if you look at Burrow's stats, I mean, he is a top 5 quarterback. Him, Jamar Chase, and the receiving squad are crushing it. And we keep losing.
There was a
every
stat
single week.
To what you said, like I think Burrow has 4 games or 4 or 5 losses this year where they put up over 35 or 38 points and lost. There are only 2 other games, I think, in the NFL this season for any team that scored that many points and lost. And I think they said Tom Brady in his entire career, when he put up that many points, only lost twice, right? And to your point, I mean, you definitely can't blame the quarterback.
Yeah, it's like my fantasy team every year. I put up a ton of points, but the team I go against just puts up a ton of points that one week.
Yeah.
And I lose. But whatever.
Well, anyway, elsewhere in the NFL, if anybody watched the Black Friday game, the Chiefs-Raiders, in total Chiefs fan, if anyone out there is a Chiefs fan, like, cool, I'll see you in the playoffs. But literally, you can't make this stuff up. The Raiders are up 17-16. I'm sorry. The Raiders are down 19-17. They're in field goal range to do a game-ending field goal. They had like 7 seconds left. They were like, we'll do one more play, get a little bit closer. There's a false start. It ends up, the play gets whistled dead. The quarterback, whoever, like fumbles the ball because he didn't call for the snap. It was just snapped erroneously. So then Kansas City recovers it. The refs get to the sidelines and they're like, you know what? That wasn't a false start, which would have blown the play dead. They're like, that was a illegal shift, which made it a live ball, which means Kansas City got it on a turnover, which means the game's over and Kansas City wins. And it's like, are you kidding me? Can't get a break over here. But anyway, yeah, Chiefs still only have 1 loss. Bills game, I was there on Sunday night. Awesome, electric at the stadium in Orchard Park.
Shoveling the stadium out before?
No, they had.
Yeah.
It kind of annoys me. Like, they tell they're advertising. It's like, yeah, $12 an hour. I'm like, dude, you can go work at Walmart where it's heated inside for $20 an hour. And you're going to like ask your fans. They're like, oh, but it's going to be a memory. And I'm like, all right, whatever.
Good sales pitch.
Yeah.
I give them hats off.
You're going to tell your kids someday, like, yeah, I was there.
Shoveled the stadium out.
24, shoveling snow.
I was able to afford 2 beers after 3 hours worth of work, but hey.
Yeah, for sure. Josh Allen looked really good. There's that, the Superman dive play after he threw it to Murray Cooper and had a pitch back to him. He like joins McCaffrey and a couple others. He had a receiving touchdown, running touchdown, and multiple passing touchdowns in the same game. So yeah, wild. Really excited for the next handful of games here for Buffalo. But yeah, just a fun game to be at. College, really quick. We don't usually hit on college. Some wild upsets. All right. First of all, if anyone's a Georgia fan, they almost lost, but they pulled off after 8 overtimes over Georgia Tech, 44-22. But the big one, Ohio State, Michigan, right? And this is like a polarizing. I'm not a fan of either team. I don't dislike either team. I know Ken Adamo is a big Ohio State fan, right?
Yeah.
And I got a lot of friends that are Ohio State fans, and there's like a depression that goes into those folks when they lose to Michigan, which their current coach seems to have a tough time beating Michigan.
4 straight year losses, I think.
Yeah. But it was just wild, man. Like they couldn't do anything, couldn't get the points going. And then at the end of the game, just a massive brawl. Michigan tries to plant their flag at midfield, and big fight breaks out. Took about 100 cops to break them up, and they're macing players on both sides. But yeah, to all you Ohio State fans, sorry for your loss. If you're a fan of that team up north, good job on the victory. And yeah, it's always a fun one to watch every year. But all right, news. We put out a good newsletter yesterday. Check. I think it was. I shared one of the things. Well, I shared Steven's article, which we'll talk about today, so I'll skip that. But Dean had a good one on the results of like the safety week, and the most common like offenses that drivers had. It's all the preventable stuff. It's like brakes, like the stuff that like if you just have a regular maintenance program, it's too easy. But you get folks that are
true with most things in life.
On money, they're trying to cut corners. I was literally talking to someone yesterday about like, if a carrier fails, 3, or I shouldn't say fail. If they're over the federal threshold in like 3 or more of the 5 safety categories. Like it's hard if you even think about maintenance. It's hard to fail that many if you're like you're like blatantly doing stuff wrong. So I encourage everyone out there, if you have assets or if you're thinking about getting assets, maintenance and your safety stuff is really important, not just for the safety of you and those around you, but it's the reputation of your company when it comes to being approved by certain brokers or even shippers directly. So good stuff. Anything else in news before we just get right into the evolution of freight?
Did you see the Werner lawsuit going on in Texas right now?
Yeah, I think it's going after the driver.
Like 400 million something one, or what was that?
Yeah, so the passenger car on the on the other side of the highway was going 60 miles an hour, lost control, and hit the Werner driver that was going 50.5 miles an hour, whatever. And so it was the driver's fault, but Werner got sued. And
wait, they were on the other side of the road?
Yeah, so highway, and then they were oncoming. The oncoming van lost control, went across the median, hit the Werner driver going the other direction. And,
is there a median or a barrier in between?
I think it was just like a grass. I'm not 100% sure. I was catching up on Matt Leffler's content about it.
I did see that yesterday. Okay, so they sued Werner, trying to say like the driver had some fault.
Well, they won originally.
Really?
And Werner appealed it because, I mean, it wasn't the driver's fault. He got ran into, and unfortunately, somebody lost their life, and the rest of the family got injured.
Have you fallen victim to double brokering, cargo theft, or identity theft? Quickscope stands out as the only load-level fraud protection tool available today. Unlike any other solution on the market, Quickscope is deployed post-agreement between shippers or brokers and carriers. Shippers can rest assured that their cargo remains secure. Brokers can confidently confirm the identity of the individuals on site for pickup, and carriers can trust that they'll receive timely payment. Start your free trial with Quickscope today by visiting them online at quickscope.com. That's QUIKSKOPE.com. Blue Book Services is the resource you need if you're transporting fresh produce or lumber. Their online databases contain thousands of companies throughout the produce and lumber industry supply chains. You can easily search their databases to generate new sales leads. Blue Book's credit ratings help you avoid companies with high credit risk, and their team can help resolve disputed loads. To learn more, go to producebluebook.com or lumberbluebook.com and click Join Today. You know what it reminds me of is I always thought about this when I worked for Conway. The company had a policy where if a driver was ever involved in an accident that had a fatality, or if the driver ever had an overturn, like if they ever tipped over, doesn't matter the circumstance, automatic termination. And I was always like, well, what if? And they're like, no, defensive driving. And I'm like, all right, I get the overturn thing. Like, you're either driving when you shouldn't be because there's a ban based on the wind, or you're taking a turn too fast. Like, those are preventable. But if somebody hits you and you tip over, like, or the fatality one, like this case, like if a driver just erratically comes into your lane and hits,
there's the laws of physics.
And I'm like,
there's only so much you could do reaction time with 80-some thousand pounds moving down the road at the legal speed limit. If somebody is coming at you at 65 miles an hour.
Yeah. So I always thought that was a little suspect, but yeah, that's wild. So what? It got overturned then through an appeals process, or what?
Well, it's in appeals right now. They had the hearing yesterday.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what the result of that is, but I'm sure if you follow Matt Leffler, he'll have it the second it's ruled.
Yeah. So. That's good. The armchair attorney. Well, cool. So if you guys didn't get a chance to read Steven's article, he did a good piece last week on if you go to our website or anywhere on social or check out our newsletter, the link's in there, but it's titled From Regulation to Deregulation, the Evolution of Freight Brokers and Transparency Laws.
Stephen, it's obvious why you felt the desire to write a piece on that because everything that's been going on. But this is something that we've never really, we talked last week about, 1980, deregulation, CFR 371, all of that stuff. And I will, when we get to that point in the discussion, I know we had some unknowns that we fact-checked and have answers on today as far as when everything changed. But we never really talk about the early days, and I think you did a great job at digging into that stuff last week. So why don't you kick it off and kind of take us through the beginning? Like, how did, brokerage all start and all that? And then we'll walk through its evolution.
Yeah, so in what I researched, the trucking industry, one of the main pivot points is the Motor Carrier Act of 1935. A lot of people think that 35 was the first one, and 1980 was the repeal of those regulations. And the reason that the 1935 Act came along was they'll say price manipulation and markets and fraud and all that stuff, because there were freight brokers prior to 1935. They were not federally regulated in any sort, unlike today where there are some regulations. But they were the cause of some price manipulation and theft and fraud and all that kind of stuff. The mafiosa era of our timeline. And then the 1935 Act came about mainly because the railroads were lobbying. They were losing business to this unregulated industry of trucking, and they lobbied the ICC and the federal government to bring them in.
So the ICC, that's the Interstate Commerce Commission?
Yeah, Interstate Commerce Commission, I believe. Okay. Yeah. And I think the railroads were brought under that factor, and I believe it was 1887. So they were pushing them to get into that so they could stop losing business to all these trucking companies. So then 1935 starts, and now freight brokers, property brokers, have to register with the ICC to get a license to be a property broker, and also trucking companies. And one of the stipulations is you had to prove that your service would have a general purpose of good for the community. This was for trucking, and this was for property brokers. So
I'm guessing they're just trying to get rid of any of the mob-based schemes, scams, or just bad stuff in general that was happening.
Yeah. So that was they were really just trying to tighten up who can participate in the industry. And even so far, like if you're part of the TIA, you get those emails that say, here's the list of new entrants. You have 30 days to comment on whether you think they should be a TIA member or whatever. The ICC did the same thing. You would register to be, you would give your answers, they would review your answers, and then the public would be allowed to then review your response to determine if you could be a broker or whatever. So
what's interesting about that? Because Ben, we've talked about so many times in our earlier content, like how to start your brokerage, and one of the steps is there's that protest period, right? Like once you file for your authority, I think it's like 14 days still. But like Stephen just mentioned, the TIA literally sends an email out to everyone saying like, hey, here's the new folks that are applying to become TIA members. I've never once seen like a list from the FMCSA like, hey, here's the people trying to get their authority. Do you want to protest it? Just another example of how the FMCSA doesn't use much of the abilities that they have to stop the bad from coming in. Another thing, too, like you think about Canada. We've talked about it a few times. Like there's only 2 provinces in Canada that regulate brokerage at all in Canada, and it's Ontario and Quebec. Like every other province in Canada, there's no rules. Like literally it's the Wild West. Mexico,
I've had it.
I don't even know. That's literally. I don't even know if they just probably just do whatever they want. Bribe off the cops. I don't know. Crazy. All right. Sorry, not to go on a tangent.
Yeah.
All right. So 1935, the Motor Carrier Act comes around, and now you've got to register. So trucking companies too, though, brokers and carriers. Okay.
Yeah. Anyone trying to service freight over the road. within the confines of a motor carrier or a property broker, or the household goods was those were all part of that. But it was restricted to specific commodities and geographical areas, which is the craziest part. So
Explain that.
There were some, I can't remember which ones, but there are some commodities that you could put on a truck that was not governed by the ICC and regulation. So you were still operating in that pre-1935 context. And there are comments during the 1980 deregulation where carriers were talking out about deregulation because of the issues they dealt with brokers that would operate in that space that was unregulated because of the commodities. So when you got your authority as a carrier, you were relegated to not only geographical areas, but commodities that you could haul. And brokers at this time, there was 70 licensed property brokers. And by the 70s, before deregulation, there was only 5 active left. And the main reason was because it was so difficult to match up carriers that were authorized to work in geographical areas. LTL. Exactly. Yes. You're trying to find these people with the authorities that can haul this specific commodity and this freight in this area. And that's why like trip leasing was a thing. So to get for you to haul freight for another carrier or a broker, you actually had to go to their physical location and the driver had to get a trip lease before they could go pick up the freight. So if you think about it, you're a broker where I'm at in Cincinnati, and you've got a driver trying to pick up a load in Cleveland. He has to physically come down to Cincinnati, sign some paperwork, then go back to Cleveland to pick up the freight and take it to wherever. Which was one of the reasons for the deregulation. There was the inefficiencies in the supply chain. The things could not get picked up on time, so you couldn't have this just-in-time supply chain that we have now in manufacturing. There was a study done I think it was a year after deregulation, where the cost of warehousing product had dropped by 10.8%, which, if you'd factor in for inflation, would be $42 million in just warehousing cost gone out of suppliers' budgets.
And to be honest, like that kind of doesn't surprise me. Like if you think back to that time period, right? One, I don't even think the FBI was established until at least the mid or late 30s. It might have been the late 20s. And it was basically Hoover was able to get it approved because bootleggers were able to commit crimes across state lines, but law enforcement had no ability to chase a criminal to the next state. So all of basically the country's ability to fight crime was geographically defined until they started passing those things. And then wire fraud and that also was chasing gambling. The reason they started that was because the mob figured out a way that they could take bets through wire services out of small areas of the country and pull money across state lines and not be running afoul of any laws because they weren't in that state. So it does kind of make sense. And also like a lot of business back then was very regulated in a sense to keep profits within certain areas, not even geographically, but in commodities, right? Like steel industries, you didn't have labor unions back then. The railroads pre that, like they were run very much towards the goal of a monopoly. You know, they passed I forget what it was, in like the teens or whatever to fight monopolies, but that still persisted in the way they behaved. Like they really protected the moats around their business. They didn't want anybody moving their stuff. They didn't want anybody else to be able to buy a competitor's good. They did everything they could to protect those businesses. So like, to me, it kind of makes sense that it played out that way. But to your point, you know, as things progressed over that 40 years into the 60s and 70s, a lot of those things started to change, right? Like the federal government started cracking down, creating new laws to go after organized crime. They lost some of the foothold over the unions. Jimmy Hoffa, right? And the famous story and like how he ran the largest union in the country. He was as powerful, arguably.
Teamsters,
The
right?
Teamsters, yeah. I mean, they at the time were like he was almost as powerful as the president of the United States because he could literally stop all of trucking in the United States with a phone call. Like, if you can stop the goods and services, you have tremendous influence, right? And then they found out he was funneling so much of their pension money right into the mob that they invested into Vegas and things. So, I mean, like, it kind of makes sense that things play out that way in that context. I'm kind of curious what the 70s look like versus the 80s as
So I went
that
ahead.
passed.
I looked up really quick, just a little to add in some stuff here on the Motor Carrier Act of 1935. Is that what it is, right?
Yeah.
So a couple of highlights here, specific to freight brokers. So it said you had to require proof of, quote, public convenience and necessity to make a more controlled environment for brokers. And what was the other part here? Yeah, basically the authority was granted from the ICC, which you mentioned. So okay. So we live in that era then for 50 or 45?
45 years.
Yeah, 45 years. Okay.
Right. So one of the things that is a lot of people forget now, and kind of what the transparency stuff, I'm not saying it'll lead to this, but there's an argument to be made for that. But during that time of regulation, like the idea of an RFP, like that wasn't a thing. Rates were indicated on lanes. And the way that was determined is if you were a carrier and your authority serviced this commodity on this lane, you had to post your rate to the ICC. And then they had 30 days to determine if your rate was good or bad. And then your competitors got to weigh in on whether your rate was good or bad. So if you had a new customer in this lane with the commodity that you're allowed to haul, you had to post the rate that you'd be hauling it for. And any of your competitors or people around you could say, no, that's too much. They can't be, or that's not enough. They need to raise the
Wasn't
rate.
there something like a 10%, like whatever the rate was that was authorized, you had to operate within like a 10% window of that, or am I way off? Okay.
Yeah, and the reason was for the brokers operating in the space, because in that 10%, if your company couldn't haul what you're supposed to because of the regulation how it was set up, and the broker, your bona fide agent for your carrier, put it on another carrier, that 10% was to go back to the broker, and that's why the transparency was set in place. So there was that window of 10% so that the broker could get their commission if they were, to find the carrier and do the trip lease and get all that situated.
So again, just to recap, the rates were regulated. As a motor carrier, you had a specific either a commodity or list of commodities you were licensed to haul. Then you needed to get through a regulation to have the price for that shipping lane approved for your customer. So I haul meat. Yeah, so I haul meat, and my customer wants to send that meat to their customers from Florida up to Nate in New York. I go, okay, I want to charge this guy $1 a mile back then. I'm sure it was less with inflation, whatever it is. I submit that rate to the ICC. They then put it out for all the other trucking companies that move commodities on that lane. They can say, hey, this is in line with what we're doing. It's either too much or too little. It then gets approved. Now I can run that. And if my trucking company can't move that load for my customer because of whatever reason, guys are sick, trucks are broke down, I can have my broker, right, call Nate's trucking company, and Nate could run that load for my trucking company. But Nate, right, needed to lose 10% off his rate that I would get as a broker for fulfilling that contract.
I believe it said it was up to, like, you had to be within 10%. You had to pay within 10% of that approved rate. So if you paid a little less, that results in a margin then.
Got it.
Naturally.
And those rates were publicly posted. So, like, your customers would actually know what rates you're moving commodities in regions before even contacting you.
Yeah, so you don't need an RFP. They could kind of look and go like, this is what it costs to move this truckload of meat or widgets from here to there. This is what the ICC says. I'm going to go find a carrier that wants this business. Hey, these are the rates that it looks like everyone else is charging. Where are you going to be at? So there's no need for competition at that point.
Right. So think about this, right? We go back to COVID 2020, 2021, right?
In freight, time is money and efficiency is key. That's where Levity comes in. Imagine automating your email operations to do more with less effort. Levity connects directly to your inboxes, extracting vital information from emails and attachments in real time. It seamlessly integrates with your TMS, empowering you to quote faster, build loads more efficiently, and book more freight in less time. Whether it's incoming emails from shippers or carriers, Levity's got you covered. It understands any language, any format, and even interprets non-standard formatting. Visit levity.ai today to sign up and get started.
Tired of struggling to find accurate rates and the right carriers for your freight? With DAT1, you can access more than 500 million posted loads and trucks every year. That's 3 times more capacity than any other load board. Plus, their integrated freight management system makes it easy to cover loads 24/7. They have the most trusted network of carriers, brokers, and shippers in the country. You'll get real-time rates on every lane so you know exactly how much a shipment will cost before you commit to it. Plus, you get instant access to top bids from qualified carriers around the country. Get 10% off your first year of DAT1 when you visit the link in the show notes.
Carriers would literally buy more trucks and just find the highest paying stuff and chase it around the country. This prevented any of that. Literally,
correct.
The rates are set. You're not allowed to go chase stuff that's not your commodity or not your region. The government is literally telling you, here's your place.
Stay here.
Stay in your lane.
Yep,
right?
literally.
And which creates a ton of inefficiencies.
Yes.
Not only that, but near the end of regulation, which I got a couple anecdotes, but near the end of regulation, it was next to impossible to get an authority to be a trucking company. And even in the article that I read, which Northeastern Law, I think, put it out in like 1993, it was easier to buy a company outright and get their authority than it was to apply for a new authority, because you couldn't get past the needs, the convenience and needs of the public, because it was already like
per their
it was already being met
of what it was.
Right. Exactly. And so, like, for example, the company that my dad used to work for, they were built off the fact that the owner's father sold Subler Transfer in the 70s, like 75, for an exorbitant amount of money because he was selling the authority. And then within a couple of years, that authority that this person bought was worth $0 because they'd opened it up to everybody. And he obviously invested the cash, and then later on they would start another trucking company.
And that makes sense, right? Like, because if you think about how that came into existence, right? It came into existence when all of trucking was unionized. So they're organized. They're all paying dues to one party that is lobbying for their benefit. Well, what's in the best interest is the people that are already there paying dues, not letting new people in, being able to regulate to make sure everyone's making as much money as you want, and you don't let anybody else in. And that's to the benefit of it, except it's not exactly efficient, to Nate's point. Nobody can get into the trucking business, and everything is regulated to basically the existing companies. So there's nobody that can come in. There's no free market. You can't, hey, I want to plant my flag and own a trucking company someday. You literally couldn't do it unless you bought one.
It reminds me of, what's the thing in New York City with like cabs? They have to have
the medallions, which changed through Uber and
Lyft,
really good case study, and even watching the movie to understand how that broke down. But it's very similar, and that actually operated a lot kind of like indentured servants. Like, you had to go work with a guy who had the medallion. You had to run against the clock every day. Like, one of the reasons why everyone said cab drivers drove terribly and caused accidents was because when they interviewed them, they went, dude, I start my day owing $200. I only have this many hours to make that money and then some, because every day I go to work, I start in debt. And there was really no free market for cab drivers because of a very similar system.
Yeah. So, all right, I want to revisit now where we, you asked me last week on the show about when did the transaction change from a single transaction to two, right? So basically, previously, shippers paying motor carrier, broker receives a commission off of
whatever the
rate
was. Okay.
Yep.
So in 1980, the Motor Carrier Act of 1980 deregulated what the ICC had previously.
I want to know why too. Can you start with why it was? Because I remember you had told us like even the reason it was deregulated wasn't for brokers. I think you had said the major reason was carriers didn't want it, right? Like what was the actual motivation to change this in the late 70s into the 80s?
I mean, I'll fact check it right now. Steven, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, so deregulation as a whole was because of the inefficiencies in the market. So the large shippers were complaining to the government that the trucks were not showing up on time, things were not moving fast enough. And then, as I mentioned earlier in this, there was that case point on warehouse storage that somebody had done a study the first year after deregulation and found a 10.8% drop in spend. And then after deregulation, they were opening up free market because that was kind of the thing during that time. Was
in the late 70s, you had massive inflation.
Yeah. So I have all your answers right here, and it's exactly what I thought. I want to make sure I didn't say it wrong, though. So basically, this is part of a nationwide change and shift in the way we did things. So in the 70s, initiatives with the Nixon administration, and then eventually carried out through Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, was all about deregulation across the board.
The industry,
when President Carter signed the bill, here's what he said. This is historic legislation. It will remove 45 years of excessive and inflationary government restrictions and red tape. It will have a powerful anti-inflammatory effect, reducing consumer costs by as much as $8 billion each year. And by ending wasteful practices, it will conserve annually hundreds of millions of gallons of precious fuel. There's another point. All the citizens of our nation will benefit from this legislation. Consumers will benefit because almost every product we purchase has been shipped by truck. And outmoded regulations have inflated the prices that each one of us must pay. The shipper who uses trucking will benefit as new service and price options appear. Labor will benefit from increased job opportunities, and the trucking industry itself will benefit from greater flexibility and new opportunities for innovation. So yeah, this was all about the consumer, about the trucking company.
Yeah.
Remember, brokers were very limited in their ability to operate and how many existed. The deregulation is what allowed people to then flow into this space.
Well, you're right. And at the time, right? Like, think about that. Like, late 70s, massive inflation, like 15%. Like, interest rates, I think my parents told me, and they bought their house in like 79, the interest rate was like 16% in the house. You had gas lines. You could not get gas when you wanted it. Like, you had to wait in line. My mom was a nurse, and they had like a card for like medical professionals that allowed you to actually get gas because it was so limited. So everything's getting expensive. Nobody can get gas. Nobody can afford anything. The government goes, hey, we've got to cut this red tape to make things cheaper and more efficient, right?
Yep, exactly. So then this act happens. It's signed into law in July of 1980. Obviously, whenever you have a big sweeping change like that, it takes a lot of time for the evolution of it to really set in. So part of that deregulation put in place that, hey, now that brokers are allowed to operate more freely and we're going to open this door up, if they're going to be paid commission by a carrier, we need to make sure that they can see transparently what the price being paid is so they know what their commission is going to be. So that's why CFR 371.3C was created, was to actually protect the freight broker. Now, because it opened the door for brokers to create direct relationships with shippers and allowed for a two-transaction system where I, as a broker, I can potentially just go charge a shipper myself and pay a carrier if I can work that out. It took years, though. The research I did said it took until about the mid-1980s until that two-transaction system became the normal way of doing business. So for the first handful of years of deregulation, you still had a lot of people doing it the old way of like, hey, I'm gonna go find a load for you, Mr. Trucking Company, and I'm gonna find a truck for you, Mr. Shipper, but you're still gonna pay the carrier direct and the carrier's gonna pay me, and that's why we have CFR 371, is so I as a broker am getting fairly compensated for the work that I did. And then eventually the broker's like, well, I'm allowed to just charge the shipper myself and pay the carrier a lesser amount because it's deregulated now. But think about how long it takes to develop these relationships, establish brokerages, right? expand your network out. It took years and years and years before that became the norm. And then that regulation essentially became, pointless. It's not the way we do business anymore. Get rid of it. But here we are 20 years later.
So 2 questions. The one,
40 years
Stephen,
later, sorry.
wasn't that a regulation originally opposed by C and the proponents were brokers?
Yeah. So if you look up 371.3C, and on the FMCSA website, there's actually a link to the original document, and you can see the comments on the Federal Register. And Yellow Freight was the one that I've shared a lot, saying that they opposed it because there was no need for commission for the brokers, and the federal government that was regulating it at the time came back and said, well, if you don't pay them a commission, then you're just getting a sales and traffic team for free, and that we don't stand by that. And the Property Brokers Association at that time was pushing heavy for it because it was a one transaction system. And if you look at one of the interesting things is if you do a Google search on like the history of freight brokerages, all of them start with a company called American Backhaulers, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
Yep.
Who was started by Jeff Silver, the father of Andrew and Matt Silver. They started in 81. He would be, I would love to talk to that guy because I'm sure there's some more information in there that he could expand on. But he started American Backhaulers in 81. They sold 5 years later to C.H. Robinson, which is credited with being the first broker. They actually started in 1905. They were a produce broker, and they brokered their own produce with their own trucks. I'm not sure how it all worked, but they've maintained property broker status from 1905 to today.
Here's the thing that I wanted to tie into what Nate said, and this would be my guess, and this is what I would love to ask him, is if you can't get into trucking without buying a company for 45 years, you don't have a lot of people trying to get into there because you can't, right? Even once you change it, the laws, and people that did want to can't get in, to Nate's point, like it takes time. So one, when you regulate the number of trucking companies, right, it will take years for people to realize they can now get in that business and can learn it and can do it, which to Nate's point would take time. So I bet as the carrier base expanded, right, and as brokers were finding more shipments that they could put on different trucks as new trucking companies came into business, like the network expanded, right? And as time went on, like, okay, and this is the thing that I have a very big point of contention with the argument currently, is that everyone on the trucking side wants to say that brokers are the issue. But economically speaking, brokers don't have anything to do with the supply and demand of freight. That's just the things we buy in this country, okay? What the other side of that is the demand to move the freight or the demand for a truck. It's the number of carriers that are able to move freight that has expanded that drove rates down. So as all the trucking companies came into the industry after this regulation, I'm sure, and to the point of the regulation, pricing came down because you have competition, right? It's the same reason pricing goes up and down in the current market. Lots of carriers run in when there's a problem like COVID, and then prices go up until too many come in and you have an oversupply, then prices come back down. That is the way supply and demand cycles. That's why it functions for so long. It expands until it can expand, and then it shrinks for a period, then it expands again. That has nothing to do with anybody in the middle. It has to do with the economy and what we're making and buying in the US and the number of companies that can move the thing that we're making and buying. Brokers in the middle have anything to do with the pricing aspect of it. It's if a carrier's willing to run it and another guy's willing to run it cheaper, it's not the broker's fault for picking the cheaper one. It's that there are more carriers willing to run for less rates. It's the supply of trucking companies that drastically affects the rates, not anybody in the middle.
Yeah, I want to give you I can't believe I haven't shared this story before, but this is so Pierce Worldwide, where I work. When we went to DC a couple years ago, the first time we were really arguing transparency, my boss, Kevin Pierce, he's the current owner, he explained beautifully the evolution of the single versus double transaction and the transparency needs. So basically, if you go back, his dad, Warren Pierce,
drove truck in the 60s and 70s, founded a brokerage in 1981, right after deregulation. So like one of the oldest freight brokerage companies around there. It's changed names and authorities over the last 40 some years. But it was originally Warren Pierce Truck Brokers, I think was the name. And he said, and he explained it to the congressman, he said at the time, we were transparent because if the trucking company was paying me, we would charge a 5% commission to find them a load. If I was funding the load for them, aka I'm going to go invoice the customer and pay them, we do 10%. And he had it set in stone that way from the beginning, and that's how it was. And then eventually, the brokers just started to cash flow all on their own, and it was like, well, there's no need for us to be transparent about this anymore, because at the end of the day, if I'm as a broker, like he said, if I'm not funding the transaction, all I'm doing is finding you a load, well, then I'm just a salesman. And yeah, 5% commission. Sure, yep. Cool, all good. But I want to make sure I know what the sale was so I get my commission on it. The same way if you're a salesman for anything, you want to know what the actual profit on that was so your commission's calculated properly. But now that I'm no longer just a salesman for you, but I'm legitimately the bank and I'm funding all of it, well, there's really no need for you to know exactly what all that is, and that's where fair market comes into play. But that's a great example of why it was there to protect the broker, but it went away from it so fast.
And I want to go into two examples of why that matters. When a carrier says, well, like, I should just be able to get whatever the shipper pays. The first I always say is, like, there are lots of instances where a broker moves a load for a loss. I don't know any carrier that's going to be willing to eat a loss just to help that customer, right? Because they don't have a long-term benefit. Maybe if they work directly with that shipper, they would. But through a broker, like, they don't really get a long-term benefit, so it doesn't make sense. The second point is there are many times where a shipper will pay more than the shipping rate to find a truck that nobody can find. So if a broker has 6 people making calls for 6 hours to find any truck in a very rural area where there aren't many, or finding a truck in another city that is willing to deadhead and then pick up that load, right? That money is not being paid to move that good. Like, they're paying for the shipment, but they're paying a premium to find what nobody else can, right? So also, like, economically, like, why would a trucking company get a better rate because the brokerage had to work harder to match that truck that actually is going to move the load with the shipper that need it, right? Like, that's the point of free market capitalism, is that the incentive allows the intermediary to work harder to find more freight for a truck. And in an environment where more trucks are competing with each other for freight, there's a benefit to the trucking company because they just ended up with a load they never would have found because this shipper needed a load urgently 400 miles away, and they're willing to pay them dead miles. Hey, I'll give you $2 empty a mile, and then I'll give you $2 10 cents a mile for loaded miles. Like, it's not that they're not getting paid, but the premium is not for the service of just moving the load. It's also locating the right truck in the right time frame with the right criteria, service records, maintenance, and all of these other things.
You know what else too is if I'm a motor carrier and my issue is with broker margins, I am more than welcome to go contact a shipper directly.
Correct.
Or start my own brokerage, talk to a lot of shippers, broker to myself if I want on some loads, and broker out the rest of them. There's nothing stopping anybody from doing this. So yeah.
I was going to say, before we go down that path, the one thing I wanted to point out.
We did that enough last week.
The one thing I wanted to point out is Bennett was talking about supply and demand market, and so one of the things that that happened post MCA of 1980, and someone will have to fact check me, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Is there was almost within that first year a 40% reduction in shipping rates to carriers because there was a massive influx of not brokers,
trucking
companies. People were popping up all over the place, and it just flooded the market, and bankruptcies were just stacking up, almost very similar to what we're seeing now. COVID happened, people bought a bunch of trucks, just like Nate was saying earlier, and flooded the market. The same thing happened in 1980. And if you play transparency out, while you're not, incentivizing new people to the market, you're exposing rates. And to think that that would not drive rates down is just a lack of awareness of historical
Free
context.
market.
Trucking, yeah.
Yeah. The other interesting thing I think that correlates with this is, and I haven't dug into this at all, but Waste Management is based in Florida. The guy who started it, Wayne Huizenga, I think he owned the Dolphins for some point. And I don't think he might not even be alive, but definitely, billions of dollars. He did this with garbage pickup. Like in the 50s and 60s, there were local garbage companies that would argue with each other and fight for communities' contracts. Those communities would pay that local trash company. They would pick up the trash in your community and take it to a dump. There was not like municipal trash services. There were not regulations as to who would do this. So the mob was heavily involved in the 50s, 60s, specifically in New York. Like you couldn't get a trash contract without paying them the kickback. Well, as that got deregulated, and my guess is somehow trash is probably still included somewhere in there, because around that same time frame, that's when he was able to consolidate and be able to use economies of scale. Hey, I'll buy trucks, and if I buy more of them, they're cheaper. And if I can pick up your trash and sell my service to your municipality for cheaper than the local company, everybody wins. Well, they became a national player and ended up being able to grab other markets, and everybody got to have their trash moved cheaper, right? Now, again, anyone can argue whether progress and change is a good thing. But at the end of the day, like if you're going to live in the United States, like that's one of the things that is the foundation of how the country functions. Same thing happened when Walmart came in the 90s and started putting small mom and pop businesses out and all these other families. It's not that they did anything illegal. They just sold things cheaper. And when you sell things cheaper, it drives prices down. Smaller companies went out of business. This was a huge thing in common culture in the 90s and 2000s, because so many communities were shifting into this model. We're seeing it shift a little back now where like we don't shop that way anymore. But like the one thing that's constant is change in the United States and how we do things. And the only reason change can continue to make progress is because of free market, meaning the fact that if I sell something cheaper than the two of you, I got to deal with that. But if I can make the thing cheaper than two of you and stay in business, it's not my fault that I am able to charge less rates than the two of you. And you guys shouldn't be going to the government and saying, well, let's regulate the widgets that we all compete and sell because Ben sells them cheaper and I can't make money on that. Like that is completely against everything that makes the United States' economy function the way it does.
So here's a stat from the U.S. General Accounting Office. Rates charged by LTL carriers fell 10 to 20%. Shipping rates overall declined upwards of 40% after deregulation. That is good for the
everyone.
Consumer, right?
Consumer. Everybody that buys things.
You could make an argument that the trucker was, through federal regulation was gouging the American public for 45 years, but it wasn't their choice. No. It was regulated and set in stone. So,
one of the fun things in doing this is I talked to my grandfather quite a bit, who got started in trucking in the 70s, and he actually worked for Victory Express. If anyone knows the history on that, Victory Express was bought by U.S. Express, which is the Fuller family company, and then they ended up selling to Knight-Swift not too long ago. But he was in operations, and one of the things he talked about was the interactions with the Teamsters, and he said, James Bond got the underdesk gun from trucking companies, not from CIA, because of the conflicts with the Teamsters and how and drivers and all that stuff. Regulation was a wild time.
The stories, again, like I grew up in Pittsburgh, so like there was definitely a lot of mob influence, and even in Ohio and into Pittsburgh, and like the stories my dad, he worked in the steel mills, and just how things were done, like to your point, from the business side, I mean, I think it would shock people things that were like very commonplace in common context back in the 70s and 60s, where like
my dad,
violence literally got you the contract, kept it. Like that's how lots of those things actually played out back then.
Yeah, my dad actually, when he was in high school, worked at the shop at Victory. And I can't believe I've never told this story before, but there was a day a driver got fired, and he took off with the truck and trailer, and they couldn't find it. And about a month later, the trailer showed up back on the lot. And when they went to open up the trailer, the semi had been ripped to shreds and pulled in pieces and was stuffed in the back of the drive-in. Mm-hmm. That's where they found it. So.
Send a message. Undeniable. Wow.
Well, there's your history and the evolution of how we got to deregulation, because I think it's important. You know, we all talk about deregulation. That's kind of like where the story begins for a lot of freight brokers, if they even think back that far. But understanding how we got to that point, you know, I'd be curious on is like the story of the first ever freight broker. If were they even called that? Probably not. They probably were called something else. But yeah, there's got to be some historian out there who's like done all the digging to figure it out. But
I'm very much curious how it functioned in like the 20s and 30s. Like that stuff fascinates me. All the movies and all the stuff of like how things existed and how and when they were shaped and changed, to me, I think is like incredibly interesting.
Yeah. So, well, cool. Good stuff. Stephen, thanks for doing all that work and putting that article together and joining us today to talk through it.
Good.
Stephen, I got to give you like a sign off here. What do you got? Anything final? You got a little tagline or anything you want to say? Sure?
No, I mean, you know, if transparency is your thing, whether you want it or not, you know, go to the FMCSA website and leave your comments if you're so compelled to. And you'll be watching this on Friday. If you want to see more of me, I'm supposed to be on What the Truck at like noon, talking more broker transparency. If that's your thing, you know, join me. I've got opinions. Well.
Awesome. Ben, what do you got?
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, go Bills. That wraps up this episode of Freight 360. Check out the show notes for links to anything that we've referenced on this episode. And make sure to visit us online at freight360.net to see our entire library of episodes, videos, blogs, and more.
And make sure to check us out on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily and weekly tips and content. And if you'd like your question answered on the show, fill out the Contact Us form on our site, and we'll see you next week.